Yes? Not at all. You're supposed to be a little bit in, right? I'm going to be contextualizing some of the cultural referencing and social context for the region, whether it's live or us for a while. I'm focusing on three things. Cultural hybridity, which I'll explain, race dynamics, racial identity, race relations, as well as talk a little bit about gender, largely performances or portrayals of masculinity. Okay, so hopefully this will give you a broader context to kind of approach the novel with, which uses very novel language in a lot of ways. And before I start, I want to thank Kiara, I want to thank Scott Miller, I want to thank Dr. Danielle Malpica for inviting me to be part of this unique year-long freshman experience. I'm teaching another freshman class in our department in CALS, and really enjoying kind of connecting with those of you who are just settling in here at Sonoma State. Okay, well, to begin, I want to familiarize you with one of the many vernacular, slangish terms that author Junot Diaz uses throughout the book, and this is a big one because it describes the sort of population from which the main characters draw from. Do-yo. Dominican Yorks, okay? All that means is people with Dominicano ancestry, lineage, possibly even immigrants, first-generation immigrants from the DR, from the Dominican Republic, who have settled in New York. And actually, New York, I kind of want to create a broad frame geographically too for you in this novel. Where's the novel mainly set? Jersey, right? So it's not exactly New York the way we think of it as Manhattan or the five boroughs. But I do want to frame the novel as sort of set in a specific urban cultural milieu that we could call the New York metro area, which could include New Jersey here. So that's kind of my schema. That's the kind of world you need to envision, including Manhattan, all the five boroughs on the right to the east, and then over into New Jersey, where Oscar's family has settled, Paterson, New Jersey, to be exact. Okay, so Dominican York, or how he says do-yo, is that community. He also, another term you might be unfamiliar with to describe the other Caribbean-descended major Latino group up in the East Coast, particularly in the New York metro area, Puerto Rocks. He says Puerto Rocks a lot, meaning Puerto Ricans, or specifically another vernacular you hear is New Yorkers, which is kind of an analog to Dominican York. New York Puerto Ricans. So that's a kind of vernacular phrase that you'll hear. Kind of, communities that have been very much overlapping and in relationship for a long time. Because the settlement of Latinos in the New York metro area is predominantly people from the Caribbean, although that's changing. There's a lot more Mexicans actually in New York. But historically, for some time, the primary Latino population has been of Caribbean descent. Okay. Can you think of any other Dominicanos in the United States who are famous? And there's Junot Diaz himself. Did you know these folks were Dominicanos in the United States? You might not have heard of Oscar de la Renta. Have you ever heard of Oscar de la Renta? He just passed. Who's Oscar de la Renta? Fashion designer, and in fact, I'm sure Zoe Saldana has worn some of his gowns to red carpet. Zoe Saldana, A-Rod. Their background, let's see. Alex Rodriguez was born in Washington Heights. Washington Heights is one of the major neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan, where a lot of Dominicanos settled. Zoe Saldana, a Dominican Yorker from New Jersey, as well as Queens. Oscar de la Renta, from the island and from a very elite family. So there's class differences among the Dominican York or Dominican American population. What's going on here? Any baseball fans here? I know it's a little bit, the light isn't so good. Sammy Sosa. You see the contrast here? Is anyone following what Sammy Sosa is up to? Yeah. think? Steroids make you whiter? Really? Are you oh, okay. I thought it was something he was trying to do to himself, actively. I mean, he's trying to do to himself to bulk up through steroids, right? Already there, I think that, like maybe it is just an after effect of steroids. There's a lot of gossip and folklore about why he was, the term in Latin America you would hear, or among Latinos here is blanquear, what is blanqueamiento, whitening. And we'll talk about why people throughout, for hundreds of years, since colonialism occurred in sort of white or really European domination, there has been an impetus to whiten because of certain privileges that could be accrued throughout, our sort of 500 last years of colonial history. So people thought he was sort of selling out and trying to become more white. Maybe it's just the steroids, I don't know. But already here you can kind of see there's a sort of vexed racial discourse surrounding Dominicanos and in the Latino community, specifically around people's African ancestry. Because would you consider, by our standards, do you think in the United States any of these celebrities are considered black? I mean, I know your generation doesn't want to label and categorize people, and I think that's a wonderful impulse, but would you consider, do you think of Zoe Saldana as black? Yeah? Okay. What about A-Rod? Or what I'm asking is, do we need to contextualize it as there are many people in the United States and throughout the world, but in our particular set of racial categories and our particular history that don't fit conventional historical racial categories, right? Because you're like, yeah, maybe, right? Not sure. Which is something productive and interesting to look at, and something in the struggle of being Afro-Latino. Because for everyone except Oscar de la Renta here definitely has a great deal of African ancestry, as a big proportion of the Dominican population does. So we'll look at why that is and how that particular population deals with that. And then Oscar, that's another question you might want to ask. You're not very far into the novel, but the main character, Oscar, what is his relationship to his own blackness? Also consider his sister, his mother, Junior, who's a friend of his, he's actually the narrator, Junior, Junior. Consider all of their kind of thinking in their dialogue and their internal conversations about their racial identity. There's a lot of stuff about the body, about like hair and butts and how people feel sort of racialized or not. So in phenotype stuff that they're considering in terms of how much they identify with blackness or not. So it's sensitive stuff, but it's terrain that Junot Díaz really explores as an Afro-Latino writer himself. So you watched the Black in Latin America piece on Haiti and the DR, right? Yeah? Okay, so going to the island, leaving New York for a second, going to the island, what do you know about attitudes about race? What did you pick up? Did anything stand out in the video of attitudes about race on the island, in the Dominican Republic? And maybe how it relates to Haiti, which, I mean, that whole island was called around when Columbus, right? Hispaniola. So these two nation states are in many ways, in relationship and in conflict historically. What did you learn about attitudes about race in the DR specifically? Yeah.
They consider themselves more white because their heroes are white men instead of black men.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really like Asian people all that much.
There's a lot of tension. Mm-hmm. And Haitians are very much in the Dominican Republic as oftentimes placed on the lower rungs of the labor sector as migrant laborers, right? And so there's a class stigma, there's definitely a racial stigma, there's attitudes, anti-Haitian attitudes for sure, and an identification with whiteness. Yeah, are there leaders, are they white exactly? Are they just Europeans, or is it a more mixed thing? Any other comments about what you learned about race in the DR? There's a couple pretty revealing moments when Skip Gates, Professor Gates, was interviewing some people, walking around the city streets, looking in windows. Remember he interviews, yeah.
So they refer to themselves as Indios?
Yeah, that was interesting, huh? Indio. Why do you think that would be?
They don't want to touch base with the African Americans.
Yeah.
So when they went to, he was talking to that professor at the graduate.
Yeah, a professor from the island, yeah.
He went to New York and finally realized that he's what other people see as black.
Right. Yeah, the professor, I forget his name, who Dr. Gates is interviewing, says, I never thought of myself as black until I went to New York. And Dr. Gates says, yeah, New York will do that to you. You know? And that's the experience for a lot of Afro-Latinos from the Caribbean, which is where a lot of Latinos of African ancestry are concentrated. When they come to the United States, they have never experienced their identity as sort of as rigidly or starkly coded as black. There's probably something more complex or sort of some interstitial categories that they might have identified with, or a total refusal because of the history of white supremacy or sort of European supremacy, where the impetus is to distance yourself or get yourself as high up on frankly a racial hierarchy, where whiteness or Europeanness has been historically at the top and blackness at the bottom, and then the indigenousness or indigeneity, being an Indio, has its varying stigmas as well, right? But in this case, in the DR, that's what was kind of unique to me, is like it's people prefer to refer themselves as Indio, who are dark-skinned, as opposed to negro or black, which is interesting. Because in like Mexico, I know to say, oftentimes when people say Indio, it has a negative connotation because of the vexing history of colonialism, white supremacy. To call someone an Indio actually can feel like a punch, sadly, tragically, right? So the choice of Indio versus like negro or something, mulatto or something like that is interesting. Market, unique to the DR maybe. So, in the question of the way we talk, we have this category of blackness, but I think a more useful term that you guys might not be familiar with, but you will by the end of your time in college, is diaspora. Diaspora, okay? So African diaspora. What a diaspora, does anyone know what a diaspora is? It's a little bit of an academic word, but it's useful. And throughout human history, there are many examples of diaspora. It's a group that's been dispersed outside of its homeland, especially involuntarily. If something like conquest, displacement, brute force, subjugation, something happens, war, something happens to displace people from their homeland. And then they are dispersed, kind of fleeing, settling in various places, a total loss of a rooted homeland, okay? And so the African diaspora clearly applies here what happened as a result of the slave trade. You have people of African descent, what we would call black folks, all over the world, particularly all over particularly all over the Americas, our entire 2 continents. You have a diaspora of African-descended people. Here in the United States, African Americans. But it's the people whose lineages root back, unless your lineage is as a more recent African immigrant. But the majority of black folks in the Americas trace their lineage back to the trauma of slavery and European colonialism. So you have so many people of African descent in Haiti, massive sugar plantation cash cropping. In Cuba, same thing, massive plantation economies, where European empires, right, so Portugal, Spain, Holland, England, and France, were making themselves rich because they didn't pay their labor. I mean, you can make a lot of money if you don't have any labor costs, right? So slavery was a way to enrich European empires. This went on for hundreds of years, starting in, the 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, if you want to remember it that way. And you have this dispersal of African-descended people all over the Americas. We know about our history with the South. So a diaspora, so I would frame Oscar Wilde, I would frame this novel as Afro-diasporic, if not like I mean, because he doesn't easily identify, you know, as a Black author or African American author, but he certainly explores and mines the terrain of the African diaspora as someone of Dominican descent living in the United States, which had sort of two layers of identity around Blackness. Just to point your attention to, so when you read Junot Díaz's perspective, it is to some extent, on his perspective on race is as much influenced by the kind of Latin American thinking about race as it is ours here in the United States. The United States kind of conceptualization of race has always been very binaristic, black or white. When you talk about the race problem in America, you're talking about the problem with black and white, right? Where Latinos kind of fit unevenly. The census doesn't recognize Latinos as a racial category. Asians kind of fall into that racial middle, but our discourse about race has been kind of limited to black-white relations. But in Latin America, the kind of approach is one of mestizaje, which essentially means mixing, okay? And it's not that Latin American nations have no problem with racism. I would never make that claim. Latin American nations acknowledge more how the color line has always been more blurred than black and white. But you certainly, for hundreds of years, there's a hierarchy where European-descended people have the most privilege, have the most access to the franchise, to citizenship, to property, very much like the United States. It's just that in Latin America, there's like a million different little categories, and all the nations in Latin America sometimes have their own unique categories, like mestizo, mulatto, morena. You'll come across these in Junot Díaz. Just all these middle or interstitial categories to talk about race, whereas we just have black-white, right? To most extent. Habao, Trigueña, Cocolo, I think these are particularly Dominican or Caribbean, right? Here, for people who kind of fit in the middle, who have like indigenous ancestry, European ancestry, maybe some African ancestry, like most Latinos do, actually. Most of us have both, if not, most of us have at least two things going on, if not three, right? Sometimes Latinos here in the United States have been treated very similarly to African Americans, to the point where at certain times in our history, Mexican Americans have been subject to the same kind of Jim Crow laws, segregation, even lynchings, racial violence. So that's where Latinos have sometimes fit into our racial binary, on the side of stigmatization and towards blackness. So it's a brutal history, and that's what Díaz is mining. So I'm framing, mestizaje, it comes from the verb to mix, or mezclar in Spanish. It's the process of cultural mixing that occurred along with all the sort of kind of the racial mixing that is kind of rigidly policed in Latin America, in the colonies of Spain, as opposed to here in the United States. Our color line was policed with a rigor and a vehemence that is sort of harrowing to even think about, that through mechanisms like lynchings, like the KKK, like racial terror, to keep the races separate. There was more mixing happening in Latin America, and you can also use the term mestizo or mezclar, mestizaje, somewhat as a cultural term as well, kind of as an analog or a synonym for cultural hybridity, and that's how I frame Junot Díaz's cultural orientation. So we talk about race, but now let's talk about the culture that emerges as a result of these sort of racial encounters and exchanges and fusions and hybridities. So cultural hybridity, fusion of two or more relatively distinct cultural forms, styles, identities, rituals, as a result from cross-cultural exchange, often occurring across national borders, cultural boundaries. So when people from different ethnic groups or racial groups have encounters, they live in the same cities or villages or what have you, new culture emerges, resulting from the fusion of that. What does that look like in Junot Díaz? I think that what that looks like is New York, is this New York metro area. This is Junot Díaz's world. It's his New York metro mezcla or mix. And you can even see just geographically, when you look at the whole metro area, it's kind of a circuit. There's circulating like youth culture and urban culture here. that he's drawing from and he references all the time in his work. And you can think of all the bridges, including what is the George Washington Bridge. That's the one that Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, shut down last year through his shady whatever he was doing. That bridge, which connects Jersey to New York, is the most heavily trafficked bridge in the entire world, I think. Definitely in the U.S. So there's flows of people and labor and culture all the time through this sort of metro area, with sort of some hot spots for Afro-Latino culture in the United States. Washington Heights up here is, again, where Dominicanos settled. The Bronx and Harlem being real vital spots for African-American and Puerto Rican culture. So this is my little collage. Probably won't explain all of it, but this is my little homage to New York metro urban culture. Okay? So, Harlem. Beautiful history of literature, poetry, music, jazz, swing. Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington emerged from the zoot suit, which later Mexicans wore, the zoot suit. Jazz culture emerged from Harlem. So Harlem has a long tradition of being like this cultural hotspot produced by African Americans. Then Harlem, as the years go by, because the Harlem Renaissance, what I was just describing, that's like the jazz era, so like the 20s, 30s, right? Years go by, and again, Harlem and also the Bronx become hotspots, and this is where you really start to see people of Caribbean descent, Afro-Latinos from particularly Puerto Rico, contributing to what we usually think of as just black culture or African-American culture in the form of hip-hop. I frame Junot Díaz as a hip-hop generation writer, for sure. So you'll hear his vernacular, you'll hear references to hip-hop culture pretty strongly. And it is in this metro area, like the South Bronx, Harlem, where, like Puff Daddy and all those guys are from, but the South Bronx particularly, where there are a lot of Dominicans, a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of African Americans living in the same, oftentimes very blighted and depleted economically spaces, but creating a vital culture in those spaces. So, I put the Rocksteady crew there. They were one of the original B-boy crews in the 70s, and they were almost all Puerto Rican, actually. Not African American, they were almost all Puerto Rican, of varying kind of racial ascriptions or phenotypes, right? Salsa came from this milieu. I feel like salsa is a kind of music in the background of Junot Díaz's work. It's a little more old school from the 70s, but the whole Fania salsa moment in the 70s. Those guys are also kind of like rugged and rough and a little bit playing on the pimp iconography too. That salsa emerged in New York among Puerto Ricans and other Afro-Latinos, same time as hip-hop. That's the kind of that's Junot Díaz's world. And again, Puerto Ricans heavily settled in East Harlem. So Harlem keeps coming up, the Bronx keeps coming up, Washington Heights. And now you have this upsurge in Dominicanos making a big impact on American pop culture. I don't know if any of you noticed, but the reggaeton thing, that's where Dominicanos have really emerged. You had Aventura. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Aventura. Not very many Latin music fans here, but a few. Aventura and the producers Looney Tunes, they produced like all those reggaeton hits from 7, 8 years ago, right? These are Dominican Americans, many of them from the Washington Heights neighborhood or the New York metro area who are really making an impact in American culture, particularly U.S. Latino culture. So this is Junot Díaz's world, is the way I kind of see it. This is the soundtrack to Junot Díaz's work. And then the other thing I want to point out is gender dynamics. So watch for this in the novel. There's a lot of kind of self-conscious exploration of masculinity on Díaz's part. He explores what probably is not an unfamiliar trope or even stereotype to you, the Latin lover, right? Oscar is this lovelorn, longing, kind of sexless young man who's just got crushes all the time, right? And then he gets clowned on for that. He gets stigmatized. He gets actually treated quite cruelly. There's another figure, Junior, his friend, who more fits the mold of a Latin lover. It's a very kind of particular style of masculinity. I mean, it's not as stigmatized as, other terrible stereotypes of Latinos as bandidos racers and all these horrible things, but it's still kind of a very delimited way to think of Latino men, but it shows up in our popular culture all the time, all the way going back to like early Hollywood, like 1920s movies, where you have these Latin lovers, the idea of almost like the particularly seductive Latino male. But I mean, the characters in this novel are playing into that, you know, because they're young and they're trying, you know, they're trying to kind of take advantage of these perceptions. And there is certain ways what Diaz is exploring that there's a lot of pressure on Dominicano men to fit this mold, to kind of embody and perform a very particular kind of masculinity that's very much in the Latin lover strain, a sort of Lothario, lady killer, lover boy form of masculinity. And so that becomes really problematic for Oscar, who's constantly, you know, sort of trying to find his place in the world and not able to fit that mold. Kind of a very heteronormative lover boy, kind of conquest-oriented sexuality, male sexuality. But I would, so you can see this, you know, you think of like Antonio Banderas. He's not even Latino, dude. He's from Spain. But, you know, now you can think of, you know, in Ricky Martin in the past, that was such an interesting moment because he wasn't out as gay at first, and so the Latin lover is very much pitched clearly as a very heterosexual, normative kind of performance of masculinity. And so it's very interesting to watch Ricky Martin's career. But these days, the new cats on the scene are Dominicano, right? Prince Royce, heard of Prince Royce? You guys gotta listen to more Latin music. It's U.S. Latin music. It's not like from the islands or from Latin America. It's the stuff on the radio now. You know, I forget what the dial is, but it's good stuff. I like it. But look at the presentation. You know, heartthrob, right? Heartthrob. So Oscar is sort of dealing with this expectation that Junior and other of his peers place upon him to be, you know, a sexually sort of conquering hetero male Latin lover type. That's a big part of his identity conflict, his lovelornness. I think even if you just barely are into the novel, I think you already have a sense of this. What is Oscar into? Is he into reggaeton and like hip hop and stuff like that, or what's his cultural deal? What's that? Sci-fi. Good. Anything else? Comics. Fantasy. Good. Sci-fi, fantasy, comics. Hot. It's hot, right? Actually, to some extent it is. But you know, well, you know, I was kind of brainstorming that, and there, you know, like nerds are kind of having a moment, you know, aren't they? So identifying with, it's almost like nerd culture has emerged as almost a distinctive subculture more and more. I mean, kind of it's been there for quite some time, even when I was your age, but I feel like it's really crystallized as something really, really kind of distinctive almost, and almost an appellation that people are like self-identifying with as a nerd and a geek. I mean, people are almost starting to use those terms, I think. You tell me, or I don't know. But do people identify that way? Maybe ironically? Or they just like comic books and sci-fi and fantasy and are proud of it, you know? Which has been, you know, popular among young people for a long time, but you have it being kind of mainstreamed in a sitcom like The Big Bang Theory, which I'd love that show. 40-Year-Old Virgin, right? You've seen that movie, right? Where he's painting his little figurines. But there is this connotation of sort of stigma and in a heteronormative frame, kind of sexual dysfunction, right? He can't get laid. He's 40 years old, right? I mean, you can kind of think of that as the kind of struggle of Oscar as well in this world where being really hyper-focused on these very specific texts, these very specific objects, the figurines, the comic book kind of obsessive collecting, takes a lot of energy and a lot of passion, right? And it draws Oscar away from the kinds of activities, the more like, you know, the more conventional, like street guy, like Junior and his friends, right? And there's judgment about that placed upon Oscar. So his masculinity is always in question. And also not just his gender identity, but his like ethnic, national identity, because they'll actually go further. Some characters will say, Oscar, you're not a Dominicano. You're failing at being Dominicano, because Dominicano is defined as lover boy and street savvy. And so he's failing all those fronts is the way that, you know, he's being treated in his sort of peer group. But like I said, I think, you know, maybe Oscar was a little bit before his time, because I think nerds are having a moment. I think the Comic-Con convention has, I mean, that all the celebrities go to that. It's almost like there's almost a glamour to nerd culture now, maybe. I don't know. Oscar just missed it, you know. Okay, and then one other idea I wanted to tie off to finish about sci-fi and fantasy. This is an interesting thing Junot Diaz does, because Junot Diaz himself is a bit of a nerd. No, he's a self-professed sort of, he loves all this kind of comic book, sci-fi, fantasy world. The actual guy, the writer, the professor. He also loves hip-hop, though. He also loves all that urban culture that I went over. He's into all of it, and that's why his book is so rich with all this referencing that you'll find, which I really love that aspect of this book, but hopefully this will give you some context for what he's talking about. But in particular, the world of sci-fi and fantasy, I think offers a really interesting metaphorical entree for him that he does mine to look at the trauma and the drama of colonialism's ghosts and racism in the present, of domination, of a history of, you know, our last 500 years here in the Americas, a history of oppression and great violence and domination by European, Western, and then U.S. powers over racial minorities, ethnic groups, indigenous tribes. He's specifically from the Dominican Republic, so there's a memory of Spanish conquest. And right next door in Haiti, brutal French plantation exploitation, slavery. All this history is lingering. I've kind of frame it as like it's haunting every character. In the way that I think we're all still haunted, whether you're very aware of it or not. I mean, everyone here in the Americas is still haunted by the ghosts of colonialism and European domination and our own, you know, white supremacist history as a slave-owning country. We're all haunted by it. It comes up in Ferguson. It comes up with Andy Lopez's killing. It comes up with every sort of racial flare-up that occurs. I mean, the fact that we have these categories of race that have been essentialized and naturalized in terms of biology and phenotype, that's not a scientific reality. That's a legacy of colonialism. That's when those categories were created. So all our racial hauntings, you could kind of think of as, yeah, like a phantasmagoria, I would say. So you'll find references to, especially when the book travels back to the Dominican Republic, does flashbacks to the island, you'll find in the narrative references to evil overlords, to demons, right? These are figures in sci-fi fantasy, but you know, there's a way in which sometimes truth, what is it saying? Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The last 500 years of race relations and colonial relations have been strange and traumatic and grotesque in a lot of ways. So he uses the language of sci-fi fantasy to paint a picture of actually a lived memory. So you have evil overlords, demons. He specifically cites the specter of the Ciguapa, a female enchantress, to talk about Oscar's engagements with women that he finds alluring but also threatening. You have a lot of reference to curses. I mean, the first portion of the book, it starts with a bang. It starts with Fuku, right? Fuku, the curse. So you can think of the curse, you know, curse, you can think of like a Tolkien novel or something like, or a Disney, carrying the curse, but his family is carrying a curse. His family is carrying a curse of trauma, of racial trauma, of colonial trauma, that just gets passed down generation after generation. People internalizing their own insecurities about their blackness, their identity, largely their racial identity. The sister has her own struggles around that too. These are vexing things left over from colonialism. So I kind of frame it as a world haunted, full of ghosts, of phantasms. A phantasmagoria is a space where there's lots of ghosts. There's lots of ghosts and curses in this novel. One of the main demons is Rafael Trujillo. So this is after the Dominican Republic became an independent nation from Spain, back in the like the early to mid 20th century. But Trujillo is one of these horrible dictators. There's so many of them that the United States supported for quite some time, and then I think we helped get him out. But he is one of these horrible dictators, brutally violent, disappeared hundreds and I think thousands of people. He was a terror, an absolute terror. He was the leader of the Dominican Republic during the time like Oscar's mom and grandparents lived. So he's a demon. He's a ghost. The kind of drama of colonial conquest. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. These wars between indigenous peoples and Spanish conquistadores with their metal and the pots on their head and their armed garb and coming into the Americas. I mean, down in Mexico, the Aztecs didn't know if they were gods or demons, And that memory still kind of lingers in who Latinos are, because we carry the bloodline, we carry the heritage. We're most of us have indigenous ancestry and European ancestry, and maybe also African ancestry. Most of us are products of that encounter, of that brutality. Those are our ancestors, both. There's so much folklore from folklore and real documentation from the colonial era in the Americas, so the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, that is so grotesque and so violent, it almost reads like an epic, crazy fantasy saga, right? So other tropes to pay attention to: the apocalypse, the fall, these heightened dramatic terms that I think you could recognize in terms of popular fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, like Star Wars or, these kinds of like big, epic kinds of terms are being applied in the way Diaz spins this tale of a family still haunted by racism, colonialism. And think about it, the New World. Okay, that was the term given to the Americas when, Columbus came and all that. But New Worlds are also what are being explored in sci-fi novels and pop culture. You'll find things like colonies, colonialization, but also colonies, outer colonies come up in sci-fi a lot. Oops, I think that's all I had. Okay, so that's one last frame. That's a little entree or a little way to think of why is he doing all this sci-fi referencing? Is it just because Junot Diaz likes comic books and likes those movies? He's using it. He's mining it for a certain effect. It kind of adds a level, I think, of engagement and adds almost haunted. It's like, yeah, okay, it's history. It could be boring, but I think he's really bringing the hauntedness of history alive with these tropes, these sci-fi tropes. Okay, I'll end it there. Have fun reading the novel. Have fun reading the novel. Did we want to? Yeah. Okay. A little bit of time for questions. So hold your seats. Hold your seats. Hold your seats. Okay.
Do we have questions?
Yeah.
Why does it seem like Dominican people really don't want to be labeled as black, but society is so intent on pushing them as that?
Who's doing the pushing?
It seems like it's like everybody, they clearly, when we were watching the video, they were like, we don't identify as black, but I went to New York and
Yes.
I realized I was black.
So Americans, the United States is pushing, right?
Yeah, why? Why do you think that we need them? Why can't they just be Dominican? Why do we need to push them under the label?
I'm hoping your generation is going to come up with much more flexible categories, but kind of like what I was saying, historically in the United States, we had a really rigid way of making sense of difference, and it wasn't grounded in science, that's for sure. It was grounded in maintaining white supremacy. Okay, so you had to police whiteness, and you had to make black folks or folks of color feel threatened to make any connections or have, like, God forbid, have interracial romance or sex or anything like that for so long. We really maintained a sense of anxiety over separating white from black. So in a nation like ours, where there's that much baggage and that much anxiety about separating black and white, even though it was always much messier and more, humans do what humans do, but when we come from that context, coming here then feels like all of a sudden, okay, these people don't know how to think of race or difference or ethnic difference in any way but black and white. So when Afro-Latinos come here, they're used to all those interstitial categories like Prieto and Morena, and here, those words do not exist. They just don't exist. Yeah, I think in the future people are going to be less obsessed with that. I'm seeing that direction, but that's our history. So that's behind that dynamic. Other question? Yeah.
Could you talk a little more about the
I always pronounce it wrong. Help me out. Blanqueamiento, I think. There's a syllable I'm missing. Blanqueamiento? Well, it's still something. I would say that the desire for people of darker skin to whiten physically, that's what it is. And did you catch that Trujillo did that? Rafael Trujillo? What was the scene that revealed Trujillo so Trujillo wasn't just of European descent. The demon, right? He was Afro-descended to some, he was mixed. Didn't Skip Gates go to a museum where the woman pulls out the talcum powder that Trujillo always wore? And he always wore regalia that was very Eurocentric looking, kind of Francophile regalia. He was obsessed with looking more European. Now, you can say, oh, well, why would people do that? Why can't they just be proud of who they are? Historically, some people would try to pass as white, not because they hated themselves, but because you could have a lot more safety, privilege, mobility in this world if you were regarded as white, if you fit that category. And sometimes it does come out in terms of what you could call like internalized depression, where you hate something about yourself because the society you live in has told you that it's not beautiful or it's not something to be prideful of. So, and it's still, colorism is still very much alive in our communities of color. Lots of Latinos and African Americans have gone through that thing of like wishing they weren't as dark as they are, wishing their hair texture was a different way. And then to the extent that some people have bought like face skin bleaching products, and they're still on the market. People have been doing that for a long time. So again, that's a haunting, right? That's a haunted memory that still affects our lives today. Anything else? Okay. Enjoy the novel. It's one of my favorites. Thanks.